how would you sum up, in the context of the disruption we're seeing today, inflation, the conflict we're seeing, how would you sum up the health of the energy market?
I think we're actually facing almost a perfect storm in the energy markets. We were already worried about very tight markets particularly for oil and gas because of lack of investment. And we were concerned about lack of spare capacity, particularly on the oil side as well. And so we were already thinking about potentially having prices approaching triple-digit levels even before we had this crisis involving one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. So this was coming against a global reopening from the pandemic. People were getting on planes again, driving to work. We had the COVID mobility restrictions being pulled off. And so this was a market that already had very healthy demand outlook, concerns about supply. And now we have this crisis and the potential to lose significant volumes of at least oil. And the question is what's going to happen with Russia's gas exports.
And what does the conflict mean for oil and gas markets in the short term, the immediate effect, but also long term? What do you predict looking into the future of how this might shape the market and the players in it?
I think one of the things that has caught, I would say, policymakers by surprise, particularly in Washington, has been this self-sanctioning phenomenon. There was an expectation, actually there was a view in Washington that there would be an invasion. So when people talk about no one expected this, actually the Biden administration was very clear that they thought this was their base case. But the question was really going to be, would Russia withhold supplies of oil and gas to potentially change decision-making calculations? What was unanticipated was that energy companies, banks, trading houses, shipping companies would essentially say, I'm not going to do business with Russia because of reputational risk, concerns about navigating the sanctions regime, and that we would be losing, particularly on the oil side, significant volumes of Russian oil exports through this self-sanctioning process. And the question, I think, going forward is Russian energy going to be simply unpopular or unavailable? And right now, even though we've had certain countries say we're going to have embargoes, the countries that are imposing embargoes are not major importers of Russian oil. Countries that take significant quantities have obviously been concerned about the economic cost of such measures. So it's unpopular right now. It's a self-sanctioning. But if we get to a stage, if the war is conducted in such a way that we have further energy sanctions and Russian oil becomes unavailable, then we're talking about, I would say, a materially higher price environment, which in turn could trigger all sorts of economic problems, such as companies being forced to essentially halt operations. And you could be talking about potential recessionary impacts of that. So I do think the real question is going to be how much more of Russian oil and even potentially gas could we be losing because of further sanctions?
And staying with sanctions, do the sanctions that we've seen come into force, do they have a shelf life? Is there something where they would a situation where they would come to an end and we'd have to revisit that situation?
People say that sanctions are the sort of short of war measures that countries impose when they want to try to change behaviors, but they don't want to do military action. The question is, are sanctions effective in changing behavior? And some people would say sanctions are effective in changing behavior if there is a clear process of removing sanctions and clear targets for those removals. If you think about Russia, Russia has been under sanction, actually the Crimea sanction, since 2014. The question is, even if Russia were to withdraw all troops today, have they conducted the war in such a way that the West would feel tremendous pressure from their citizens if they were to pull back those sanctions? Certainly if I think about the United States, I think there would be incredible pressure from the US Congress not to pull back sanctions even if Russia withdrew tomorrow from Ukraine. So I do think these sanctions essentially become sticky sanctions. And I think the world's 11th largest economy, or was the 11th largest economy, is going to be under serious sanctions for a significant period of time. And I think the question is going forward, how do they conduct this war? I think there are certain clear triggers for further sanctions. I would be watching very closely what is done in the United States Congress, because we want to think about Iran sanctions. The most punitive sanctions on Iran were imposed by the US Congress, and the White House essentially had to allow those sanctions to be implemented. And these are secondary sanctions, sanctions that essentially say, if you do business with this country, you will be potentially locked out of US capital markets. That is what was imposed on Iran. That's why we saw such a significant drop in Iranian oil exports. That's why when the US left JCPOA in 2018, unilateral action, countries around the world still had to halt Iranian purchases because of the secondary nature. And so to me, the question is going to be, do we see potentially secondary sanctions being imposed on Russia, which would then make a country like India, for example, reliant? Would they be willing to import Russian oil if they had to make a choice between doing business with US regulated institutions or doing business with Russia? We're not at that secondary sanctions point yet, but there are certain, I think, triggers in terms of how Russia were to conduct this military campaign, which could lead to the implementation of secondary sanctions. And again, that would make Russian energy unavailable, not just unpopular.
And looking at that from a slightly different perspective, how do you think Russia's dominance of the global energy markets is influencing the US's response and other nations' response to the conflict? How is that affecting their actions, obviously beyond sanctions?
Well, I think what's really interesting is, just look at what countries were willing to go down the route of an embargo. The United States takes less than, around 3% of their oil from Russia. You compare that with Germany. Germany takes 32% of their natural gas, 34% of their oil, over 50% of their hard coal from Russia. They have a unique dependency on Russian commodities. And so if you look at which countries have basically come out and said, we do not want to go down the route of energy sanctions, it is the countries that have more dependence on those imports. It's easier for countries that are not dependent on Russia to go the furthest right now in imposing these sanctions. So I do think the question is going to be, what is the duration and how does Russia continue to wage this war? That will impact, I think, the trajectory of sanctions.
Sure. How do you see the conflict will potentially accelerate perhaps a move towards the greening of sustainability strategies and energy strategies? Obviously, a lot of nations are moving in that direction already.
Right.
They've set timelines. Many of them have brought those forward in a response to this conflict. How do you see that playing out?
I certainly think that you've had European officials essentially saying, as part of our strategy to sharply reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas, we have to accelerate efforts towards renewables. You hear that in the United States as well. But importantly, you also have a more fulsome endorsement of natural gas as a key part of the energy transition. You have now discussions, think about Germany, talking about regasification terminals. We have the long-term, contracts that are potentially going to be signed. The Germany, think about the country they're sitting in right now, the agreements that we are waiting to hear more details on about the new energy supplies are looking to bring in from the United States, from Qatar. We have an effort towards energy security through diversity of supply, but also conversations now about making the investment in gas storage, making the important infrastructure investments that we need, because there is a view that you are going to have natural gas be part of this transition. Because one of the real problems that we're facing right now is a lack of investment in oil and gas. Part of the reason why we have this tight backdrop in terms of the supply and demand balances is because of how much investment came out of this sector. And I think there was a sense, if you think about the Biden administration, the early conversations were all about net zero. The important conversations were about combating climate change. Yeah. It was unclear, though, where natural gas fit in the transition story. And now, of course, when you have the announcements of these new agreements between the United States and the EU on gas, we see that the administration is now at least publicly signaling that natural gas has a role. Now, there's a question about, is there going to be sufficient investment because it's an infrastructure build-out required? Are we going to be able to deal with the issue of red tape in certain countries, which makes it a complicated process to permit this infrastructure? But I do think that this is an important issue that's been sort of settled right now, at least it seems, that natural gas is going to be an important part of the transition story in Western countries.
So you expect to see infrastructure growth in that area to support
I think that this military campaign, this war that we are seeing, has refocused the conversation on energy security.
Absolutely. And talking of conversations, what conversations have stood out at the forum on day one so far that have piqued your interest in your area of
I mean,
business?
obviously, I think that it was to see President Zelensky address this conference, not something that was expected, but I think that was a very important. The opening, panels were really important in terms of setting the stage of sort of what's at stake.
Yeah.
I mean, that these are such serious, momentous, times that we're living in right now, and what is the response of the global community going to be to these crises, which could be unprecedented. I mean, numerous speakers really talked about potentially one of the gravest, generational crises that we've faced.